Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. Today, we're going to be talking about religion and all of the interesting aspects of religion, how anthropologists study religion, where do we find religion, what kind of an impact do we see religion having within communities. So, it is probably one of the most studied aspects of cultural anthropology. Most anthropologists really do dive deep into religion and trying to figure out, how does all of this work? And oftentimes, because religion itself can be a major structural point within a community, especially if we go back throughout the ages, throughout time when oftentimes there wasn't necessarily a stable government in order to sort of maintain order or to keep communities together. The church, or whatever religious institution there was for whichever group, was oftentimes the one that sort of kept everyone together, that kept the ideals of a community in place. And oftentimes, because we do live in a Western world, a Western society, we're going to be using a lot of Western ideals when we're talking about religion. So bear that in mind. Not everyone's going to see religion in the same way. Not everyone practices it. Not all religions look the same. But one thing that we can pretty well determine is that every culture has a religion of some sort. And this is really interesting to try and figure out why. Why does everyone have a religion? Whether, you believe in God or a pantheon of multiple gods or animal spirits or something along that line. Why does every culture have that? We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Okay, so let's get started. So religion does play a major part in all of our lives. It affects all of us in some way. Even if you are an atheist or an agnostic, because religion has impacted our laws, our ideals, everything that we sort of interact with is going to have that, just touch of religion, even if you're not a practicing religious individual. So it's prevalent everywhere. And, if you drive around town, almost guaranteed you're going to drive by a church at some point. From religion, from having some sort of a faith or some aspect, we find that people find meaning in various things. So they find meaning in power, in love and sexuality, in mortality, in morality. It also gives us meaning as far as human origins and then the afterlife, right? And then kinship. We oftentimes find that our kinship ideals will focus around religion as well, or religious activities. Essentially, religion is a means to understand the world. And this is something that we've sort of talked about throughout the entire semester when it comes to like trying to figure things out. What do scientists do? We're looking for information, we're looking for meaning, what do people do? And religion does that. Religion gives people some sort of meaning to life. Whether or not it can be scientifically proven doesn't necessarily matter. In fact, a lot of people would say that it doesn't need to be scientifically proven for it to matter. And that's okay. As a scientist, as a anthropologist, my job isn't necessarily to give validity to anything, but it's to understand why, right? And religion sort of does this. Religion gives us these this ability to give meaning to things that we might not necessarily understand. And this is sort of obvious when it comes to subjects like death, right? What happens to us in the afterlife? Is there an afterlife, right? Do we turn into ethereal beings and go to a place called heaven or hell if you've been a naughty person? What happens after we die? And religion, in some ways, gives us an opportunity to answer those questions. So as anthropologists, one of the things that we look for are these religious insights. How do people behave? Why do they behave a certain way? And can we sort of understand how they might behave based on their religious practices? What are the types of norms and values that someone might have are oftentimes going to be readily viewable through their religious activities. What's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and where do we find those rules, right? And where are they located and how are they recorded? So religion gives us a lot of that information. Science itself has its origins in religion, especially if we're talking about like Western science, Western organization and understanding of the world comes from early priests and monks who, and I think this is really important to understand how sort of science came about and how religion has a big impact on a lot of this stuff. It's that people who do this kind of thing, they have time. They have time on their hands. And if we're going to talk about religion, if we're going to talk about science as well, we have to understand that these are both very time-consuming ordeals. So in a community, if we see that there is a highly structured and organized religion, then we know that that community is going to have a very highly structured organization of workers. If we're looking at, let's say, a band-sized group of people, so a small group of folks that, say, between 20 and 80 people, and we look at how their religious ideas are practiced, more than likely they're going to be fairly simple, fairly straightforward, not a lot of organization. And it's because when you live in a small group, and if you're hunter-gatherers, not everyone has time to sit around and contemplate this kind of thing. And so they end up having very small, very independent ideas about what the spiritual world is like, what happens after death. And we don't have a lot of organization. As you grow in size, as you have more and more people available to diversify activities. So if you live in a small hunter-gatherer group, everyone is pretty much going to be focused on subsistence living. That's making sure that everyone has food, making sure that everyone has shelter, and getting those basics taken care of first. So you don't have a lot of time to do other things. You don't have a lot of time to look up at the stars and contemplate God and religion and faith and what happens, and those types of stories. But what if you do have that time? What if you live in a community that is, thousands of people strong or more, and your life isn't necessarily dedicated to finding food and to finding those kinds of opportunities? Maybe now you've got time to think about all of those things and try and find out those answers to life that everyone is wondering about, but no one has specific answers for. Well, that's when we start finding more and more religious organizations becoming larger and more complex. And you start finding specific people that are looking at those questions and trying to find those answers. And that's where you find like priests and rabbis and imams and folks that are dedicated to answering those questions. So a lot of what what religion has sort of become depends greatly on the size of the community and access to resources. The bigger the community, the more access to resources you're going to find. If you think about, say, like small towns, right? If you have a small town, you're probably going to have a small church, right? Because you don't have so many resources going into that church, and that church is only going to be able to operate in a very limited way. Where if you were to live in a big town like Denver, you have the opportunity to attend mega churches, right? Churches that can seat thousands of people at any given time and have all kinds of resources for sound equipment and lighting and all kinds of stuff that, could only be found when you have more resources to build upon. So a lot of what religion oftentimes develops from is how many people can dedicate their lives to, gathering the food and then having a select few to focus on these questions, these, concepts about life. And it becomes way more complex when you have more time dedicating to trying to understand these questions and then to provide answers. And that's a big aspect, is how do you provide those particular answers. So as sort of a question that I throw out for each class, what makes up a religion? Right? What are the components that you need to have for a religion? So what I want you to do is we're going to go over a number of things that might be included in a religion. And I want you, as part of the discussion, is to come up with some examples of how religion is made up, and what are some of the foundations that we need to have to create religion, right? So that'll be the first thing. Come up with some ideas. We're going to talk about a few things. So first of all, and I think I already stated this, religion has sort of been at the heart of a lot of anthropologists' studies, primarily because it is one of the foundations of a culture, that a lot of the ideals and norms and mental maps and certainly symbols come from religion. It gives us a chance to dive in and see how a lot of these communities are organized. So looking at this, we look at religion is full of symbols, and we need to have symbols to create representation of ideas, right? So we've talked about what symbols can provide. So let's talk about some pretty basic symbols that we would recognize within various religious institutions now. So let's take Christianity as a basic, obvious one. What are some symbols that you might recognize? Well, there's the church. So the church itself, the structure, oftentimes has certain components to it that make it recognizable from other buildings. Let's take the cross, the crucifixion of Christ. We look at how this particular symbol represents all these different ideas. You no longer have to have the image of Jesus on a cross, on a as an image. All you have to do is just see that cross, right? You see two pieces of wood that are tacked together, one shorter than the other. You make that cross, and you instantly know what that means and what it represents and how much it represents. The Bible itself as a symbol. It is a symbol that is used. In fact, we just saw President Trump using the Bible as a symbol. And this has been done by politicians and by all kinds of folks recognizing the significance of that symbol. Whether or not you agree with how it's used isn't necessarily what we're asking. What we're asking is, why is it being used? Why is President Trump out there holding up the Bible? You know, what is he trying to say by doing this? Because he knows that the Bible itself represents a very specific set of ideas. And so if we look at that and we say, okay, so what do those ideas represent? And that's why symbols are so important, because they recognize that these items possess so much more information than just the symbol itself. Religious institutions have various types of beliefs. They have different rituals, myths, and myth isn't necessarily the idea of it is fake, because a lot of times when we talk about religion, a myth isn't something that's fake, or it's dreamed up. Myths are more about stories and more about ideas that aren't necessarily untrue. Okay, so it's organized a little bit different. You have experts. Okay, these are priests, these are imams, rabbis, shamans. These are people that have spent a large amount of time studying this type of this life, these symbols, this life. What does it mean? They have different groups, right? There might be different organizational groups within a religion. And they could be very much specific to different activities. Again, within Christianity, we've got, not only just the different religions within Christianity, if we're talking about like the Catholics and the Lutherans and Baptists and Presbyterians and all of these different groups. But then you break those down into there are nuns, but there's different orders of nuns, right? They do different things. And there might be things that they are specialized for. And you might have groups like the Jesuits who are, very much organized towards education and information, and they're scholarly priests. So you've got different groups that are organized in different ways to obtain different information or to sort of contribute or figure out something, but individually to that group. We have deities. Deities would be like God. Okay, God would be a deity. Or you might have multiple gods, so a pantheon, in which case you'd be looking at like the Greek pantheon or the Vikings, or the Hindu gods. All of these have multiple deities in different positions doing different things and having different representations. And then you also have like supernatural forces. And supernatural forces are usually used as a means to explain things that we can't necessarily explain, right? So before we understood how lightning and thunder work, okay? If we look at like, let's take a look at the Vikings. The Vikings, before when they didn't know that, atmospheric pressure and negative ions and positive ions are meeting together and creating this static charge, which then creates lightning, and then you get a lightning bolt that strikes down. They thought, hey, there's this dude named Thor who's, he's the thunder god. And, if he gets pissed off, man, he's going to be lighting the sky up with lightning and thunder, and it's going to be awesome, right? Thor's a badass. I like that guy. But we didn't understand where lightning and thunder came from, right? We didn't understand the attributes, the sort of ideas behind it. So we had to come up with a reason. Why? Why is this happening? Why am I seeing this? I don't know. I don't know what's going on. But maybe I can figure that out. Maybe I can come up with a reason. And so we do. We come up with reasons to explain. And that's what anthropologists are looking for, are these reasonings. Now, the other thing that anthropologists do, and I need to throw this in there now, is that we don't necessarily judge on whether or not religion is true, whether or not somebody's beliefs are false or not. It doesn't necessarily matter to us. We're looking for understanding why and why people behave a certain way. So you could be a practicing Buddhist as an anthropologist and be able to go in and look at Christianity or Islam and say, oh, this is how this is organized. And this is comparable to Buddhism because I have experience, because I'm a Buddhist. And these are all the differences. And so being able to make those connections. Not saying whether or not it's valid, not saying whether or not it's true or not. What we're looking for is the understanding. And so that's a lot of things that we sort of have to recognize and can sometimes be an issue, especially within anthropology. And for students, I've had a number of conversations in the past where somebody's belief is contradictory to something I might be saying in class. What I might say something that's contradictory to Christian belief. Well, yeah, that might be the case. I might say that. Doesn't mean that I'm invalidating somebody's belief. It just means that we're looking at it through very practical, very different lenses to try and understand the organization, right? The whys of why people behave the way that they do. So, and we also have to recognize, and this is oftentimes also a complication that anthropologists might run into, is that religion is a very, very touchy subject and can be very, very energetic in its practice. And if you don't agree with somebody's belief, if you don't agree with some aspect of that religion, you can create massive conflict. And so one of the things that we have to do is approach religion from a very interesting way in trying to engage people to find out why, what do you think, what's going on, and then also not necessarily to say that, well, your beliefs are wrong, or try and contradict, right? We're trying to understand. But it can be complicated sometimes. So, when you're out there and you're doing your research, take that into consideration. That this can be a very touchy subject, and that people can get very, very much excitable about it. Okay, so if we continue on sort of this and dive deeper into sort of how we define what religion is, we have to understand that religion is oftentimes about a belief that there is some sort of an entity, some sort of a God that transcends the natural world, okay, and is oftentimes defying scientific reasoning. Okay, and why is this important? Well, because, again, we were just talking about like supernatural powers and what supernatural sort of deals with. And that's part of it, that explanation, that, trying to understand something that's taking place that we can't necessarily explain and through a scientific means. At least maybe not until now, and maybe even beyond now. There's a lot of stuff out there and why science is so important. We have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. And science's goal is to try and figure those out. Religious goals is doing the same thing. There's a lot of questions that we have, and so we have to try and answer them. And both do it in different ways. So we also have to know that there are various myths and stories. Again, not myth as in something that is fake, but a myth that is more about the mythical, the special, the not totally understood sort of ideas and concepts that we might be facing. And when we talk about myth in this sense, it gives it a new life, a new definition, not necessarily to be represented as something that is a lie or something like that. It's something that is more special than just that. And these myths and these stories sort of define the meaning for life and our existence in the universe, right? The origin story, right? Why are we here, right? What made us? Why are we in this situation? And what is my goal in life? These existential questions that we have to ask ourselves. That's where religion comes in. Gives us these different ideas and different stories to sort of make everything understandable. There are ritual activities, okay? And these activities reinforce, recall, instill, and explore collective beliefs. Now, all of that stuff, what does that mean? So, as an example, ritual activity is going to church, right? If we continue with sort of this Christian analogy, a ritual would be every week you go to church and you listen to a priest read the gospel, right? And that preacher will recall different stories, different tales about what's going on, different examples of how you should live, right? And these ritual activities constantly reinforce this type of behavior. There's other ritual stuff, so that's more of like a weekly regular ritual. There's also the ritual of like a baptism, okay, and becoming a part of the church. and becoming a full member of that, and being baptized, so that, no matter what, you end up going to heaven, right? Marriages. Marriages are another ritual that are oftentimes associated with religion. Taking the sacrament, right? Taking that piece of bread and a little bit of wine or water or whatever it is, as a representation of Christ's blood and flesh, right? So each of these things are rituals that reinforce these different ideas and different beliefs that help to maintain them throughout the years. If we didn't have these rituals to continue on this process, we wouldn't be able to look at how more people are brought in to that particular religion, because they wouldn't know the stories, they wouldn't know the practices, and it wouldn't become a part of normal activity. So, it's important to understand how all of these things sort of come together. So, if we look at, let's say, the experts, okay, if we look at, let's take the priest as another example. The priest's job is to give us that information, right? It's their job to translate these different ideas to us, to lead us through example, to give us events to engage in. It helps to they help to enforce different ideologies, and the importance of the supernatural relationship. So let's break some of these down. So if we look at a preacher and they're like, they're going to translate certain events that might take place. What does that mean? Well, if there's activities going on in the outside world, right, and we don't have necessarily an explanation for them, well, that's the job of the preacher here, is that they're going to be trying to explain what's going on in our lives and why. So that can be really important to try and understand. The symbols, they're going to be using different objects to depict certain ideas. So that's why you're going to find the cross. That's why you're going to see the Bible. That's why you're going to see the type of regalia or clothing that an individual is going to be wearing. Those are all symbols of importance, right? So if somebody's walking around in as a nun with their habit, and they're teaching something, they have a certain role within the community, and that helps us to understand where they fit in, okay, and how important that can be. They enforce the ideology, and basically what that's saying is that they are continuing the process of teaching. They are continuing this process of engaging with people and giving them a chance to learn and replicate the behavior that is appropriate for this environment. And then understanding the supernatural relationships. And this is kind of a big one, and it has to do with the fact that that preacher becomes the conduit to God. Okay, they become the conduit. They become the essentially the gatekeeper, the person that has access to, and that can be a really big issue, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. You also have to have a community of believers. You cannot have a religion of one. That doesn't work. You might have your own beliefs and you might believe in something completely different than what everyone else believes. It does not make it a religion. Okay, it is not. You cannot have an individual religion. You can have multiple people, and this is why stuff like you've got the Church of the Jedi. Okay, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this. You know, Star Wars and the movies. You know, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I'm a big nerd, and I love Star Wars. But some people have taken to the point where the ideas behind like the Jedi and the Force and all of this stuff, well, it seems to make a lot of sense to them. And in Great Britain and here in the U.S. and in, I know, Australia, New Zealand, they actually have churches that were created by people who believe in the Force and the Jedi. And if you wanted to get married by someone that calls themselves a Jedi, then you could. And some people might think that is being ridiculous because it's based off of a science fiction movie that was created, you know, a little over 40 years ago. But that idealism, right, the how it's approached, and people can recognize that there are different aspects happening within this group of people that believe that we're all interconnected using the Force. Right? We're all connected. That became very, very appealing. And again, it's not necessarily the job of the anthropologist to say, well, you know, that's based off of a sci-fi show. You know, should we actually take it seriously? You know? And yeah, we actually should. And that's that emptying of bias, right? We want to get rid of that bias. But it's obviously become important to enough people that they were willing to organize themselves into this church where they have regular meetings and they have ceremonies and they have all the things that make up a religion. Whether or not it might be goofy doesn't matter, because it is what it is, and we have to understand that. And as anthropologists, we look at it and say, okay, well, how are you organized? You know, let's break it down. So we can look at how religion is actually organized in different ways. We have monotheism. So monotheism, one religion, right? One belief, one God, right? So a single God. And you have sort of the Judeo-Christian beliefs, the Abrahamic belief system, where you've got, you know, Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Then you've got like the Baha'i, and you've got a bunch of these, sometimes offshoots and sometimes independently created monotheistic religions, you know, focusing on one person. And we've seen things change over time in different places. So if we look at Egyptian history, where we had these polytheistic beliefs in multiple gods. You know, you had multiple entities that lived. And then through time, things changed a little bit. And all of a sudden, it became monotheistic with different attributes of one God creating all these other entities. Or that they lost their godlike identities and became sort of like angels of sorts, right? Different sub-gods, or part of a pantheon of individuals that were organized differently, had special abilities, you know. If we look at like Greek mythology, right? You had the Titans, and the Titans were these huge monsters, and the gods came and killed the Titans and took some of their power, and they were from the Titans, right? We have this lineage, and then the gods took over. and created people and interacted with them in some ways, and sometimes mischievous ways or sometimes beneficial ways. And all of these things would change depending on how they were treated. And if you treated your God well, then things went well. And if your God was unhappy, then you might lose your crops. All of these different ideas. So, we look at that kind of stuff. We also have to look at animism. Animism is this idea and belief in the natural world. So that could be supernatural powers based on the earth, sort of like Gaia. This concept of the earth being a sentient organism. And that all the inhabitants of the animals and stuff like that have specific powers or relationships within the world, and how we see things, and that there's power in water and fire and all of this elemental ideals. And so animism has a tendency to take a look at the natural world and give supernatural importance to it. You also have things like different sects or cults within religions, and oftentimes they are offshoots of a larger religion. So whether or not that's if you look at like Christianity, and then Christianity was broken down into different sects. So you had Catholicism, and then that broke off into being Lutheran, and all the other Protestants, and it breaks down even more into different size groups, and those cults can engage in different ways, and sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative. It all depends on who's running it. It all comes down to people, right? It all comes down to people and what they decide to do with it. If we look at shamanism, so shamanism is sort of considered to be like the oldest organization of how religion is viewed, right? Shamanism is oftentimes considered to be like the basic idea of how religion came about. And this usually involves an individual within a small group. Oftentimes, small nomadic tribes might be traveling around, and they need to understand what's going on in the world. And so you might have somebody that does that. Shamanism oftentimes includes the abilities as a healer. So you might have that as a responsibility. And so as a shaman, you might have to call upon the spirits to come and help heal someone that is sick or feeling ill or whatever, or spiritually ill as well. But shamanism itself sometimes is also seen as sort of like a part-time job. The idea is that because we're still dealing with small nomadic groups, which is where shamans are oftentimes found, or at least were. Now we're not so nomadic anymore, so there are still plenty of shamans out there, but they might not be as nomadic. But it usually isn't their full-time gig. They have other skills and abilities that they will do, and then when they need to be called, that's when they come out and say, okay, yeah, I'm a shaman, I can help with this. I can lead you along this path that we need to go by. But it's not a full-time thing. So shamanism is one of these practices that seems like, and a lot of people get this sort of misconstrued, that it isn't still practiced. But there are lots of communities that still have shamans that engage in religious activities, even if it's associated with like Christianity. A lot of Native American groups still have shamans that are practicing traditional beliefs. But a lot of times those traditional beliefs might be included with newer beliefs and newer approaches. So we have to kind of look at these in different ways. If we're going to look at something like religion and this concept of magic, okay, and people rarely ever want to hear the term magic associated with religion, and for good reasons, because when we hear the term magic, it usually means that something is impossible or is supernatural, and some people aren't necessarily comfortable with that. So the difference is that, when we look at religion, we look at magic and kind of combine these two things together, they're oftentimes created with a division, right? And this is what happens within communities, is that they might actually be focusing on the same sort of thing, the same sort of ideas and practices, but one is believed to be true, and then one is created and understood as more like taboo, that this magic can have a negative idea. And that's where sort of religion and magic split, is sort of the intent behind that practice. So it might be religious and it might be supernatural, but it's acceptable, right? This is something that we take in and understand. What becomes magic is when it's considered to be outside of the normal realm, okay? And that's where we sort of see magic, even in today's society, when you see someone go up and perform magic tricks, and they're, we all know that a lot of it's like sleight of hand, right? How are they tricking us? How are they confusing us? How are they pulling off these stunts, right? That's magic, right? That's not religion. But some people might see those sort of same things, happening to a group of people, and some people might say, "Oh no, that's religious. That's supernatural powers. That's God speaking, or God having something to do with this." And over here, this is just outside of the normal realm. Magic can be done in different ways. There's imitative magic, in which there is some sort of a performance or an incantation, or some sort of a manipulation of like a doll, like voodoo, right? That's imitative magic. And then you have stuff like contagious magic, and that's where something might come in contact with a totem or a body part that has some sort of magical effect. And we see this in different ways. So I've known a number of anthropologists that have had very interesting experiences with shamans, where in one case there's a guy that he pissed off this shaman. He's Native American. Pissed off this shaman, and this shaman gave him a curse, right? He cursed him, and he put a bear claw into his shoulder, a spiritual bear claw into his shoulder. And the guy's shoulder, right, his arm, like started hurting, and it didn't work well, and he was having all kinds of issues with it, and it was starting to atrophy. And this guy believed that he had this bear claw in his shoulder. Now, if you're going to look at this from a medical standpoint, there's no bear claw there, right? There's nothing actually impeding. There's nothing digging into the skin and causing it to do it. But this guy believes that it's happening, that this shaman cursed him. So he ended up having to go find another shaman that was more powerful than the shaman that had inflicted this curse on him. And this more powerful shaman came out and worked his magic, and the bear claw was released. And guess what happened? Well, the guy's arm started working again. Now, whether or not this is sort of a psychosomatic event that takes place where the guy's his own mind convinced himself that his arm didn't work and that the pain was there based off of this spiritual attack, or whether or not there was an actual spiritual attack, and science can't explain that. That's not really the point. The point is that as an anthropologist, our job is to try and say, okay, how did this happen, right? Why did this happen, and why did this person believe that this was happening to them? And we can gain a lot of information about how a community behaves based on events like this. So again, it's important to try and take these ideas and these examples and figure out why, what's going on here, and to try and look at it in different ways. If we look at things like witchcraft, witchcraft is always fascinating because, again, it's considered magic, it's taboo, it's this idea that it's against the mainstream culture, and yet we still have a lot of people that sort of subscribe to it. And you might have something that that allows them to communicate with the natural world. Again, so if you're a witch or a warlock or whatever, again, oftentimes it's associated with animism, so the natural world and communing with animals and trees and all of that stuff. And it's a different way of exploring the world. The thing that we always have to keep in mind is, how are these things viewed? How do we view witchcraft, right? When we think about witchcraft in a religious way, we see it as a negative, right? This is, they are dabbling in things that they should not dabble in. Why? Why is that the case? Why is one religious entity looking down upon another, even though they're, sort of looking at the same sort of things and asking the same sort of questions? And so we would engage in that, right? Try and figure out the whys. And part of it too is understanding that a lot of magic, a lot of witchcraft, a lot of even religion, and these practices, they might seem irrational, might not seem to make a lot of sense why people believe that way, but it still has a profound importance on that community. Whether you believe it or not doesn't necessarily matter. It's why they believe in it. And so it's important to, again, keep that unbiased point of view when you're studying something like this, when you're studying religion, and these different practices and different ideas about magic and taboos and all of this stuff that, yeah, it might not make sense to you. That doesn't necessarily matter. You want to try and understand. You want to try and make sense out of it. And again, trying to not sort of judge